Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. And also check out our Patreon page. I'll put a link below. On Patreon, you're going to get the ability to get exclusive content, reviews that haven't been released yet, and also a discount code for 15% off of everything in our online web store. Hi, I'm Mike, owner of the In-Groove in Phoenix, Arizona. Today I'm going to do a video discussing 10 jazz albums to kind of start a collection. These are going to be albums that if you're not a jazz fan, if you're an R&B fan, if you're a hip-hop, rock, if you're into a different genre of music, but you want to kind of explore the jazz genre, these are kind of recommended records by me. So when you come into my store, the In-Groove, I've got a large jazz selection. I'm known in Phoenix as the jazz guy. We have the largest jazz record selection in Arizona. I play jazz a lot in the store. People ask me all the time, hey, you know, I like what you're playing. I've never bought a jazz record before. What should be some of the first records I purchase? I'm asked that question 10 times a week. And I always have a few questions. I kind of base my questions. Well, what do you listen to? What do you like? And then I'll make recommendations based off of that. But I can tell you it's typically the same 10 or so albums that I kind of recommend people start in. So let's talk about those recommendations and we'll go from there. I mean, I'm going to start with my absolute favorite jazz album. That is Art Blakey's Moanin'. This is actually the album that got me into jazz. Art Blakey's Moanin' is a classic bop album. Bop from the 50s was kind of a, you know, it swung. It is a good transition for people who are into rock and roll. There is a track on here, Art Blakey's Drum Thunder Suite, which is like kind of the equivalent of a 60s, 70s John Bonham, you know, Moby Dick drum solo. It's kind of that kind of sound. If you're a rock and roll kind of guy, this for a lot of people is a real good transition to get you into jazz. This is the record that got me into jazz, and this record brings a lot of people into jazz. Unfortunately, there's no good version of this in print. This is the Music Matters SRX version, which is going for a couple $100 now. The previous in-print version, or the version that's in print right now, actually you can get that on our website. I think it's $21.99. It's okay. It's cut from digital. It runs you $22. You know, it's not to the quality of this sound-wise, and that's kind of the thing about this album. It needs to be in print in a higher quality sounding version because Art Blakey's drumming on this is absolutely fantastic. And, you know, one of the great things about jazz records is how they can seem so realistic. A decent system, a jazz record could sound like, man, these guys are in my living room playing. People ask me all the time, what are the best sounding records? Well, the best sounding records are records from this era, to where they're all acoustic instruments, so there's no computerization, there's no keyboards, there's no electronics, so they were essentially easier to mic. And yeah, these are some of the best sounding records you're going to buy are typically going to be that 50s, early 60s jazz era and classical music. Those tend to be the best records ever recorded. Not rock and roll or not, you know, your later era records, but sometimes. But there's exceptions to the rule. But as a whole, jazz and classical records from this era are really the best sounding stuff you can buy. But yeah, Art Blakey Moanin', this is a record you should check out. The next record, when I get people that tell me, you know, I like hip-hop, I like R&B, I like soul, this is one of the albums I always recommend. This is Horace Silver's Song for My Father. The reason being is this is probably one of the most sampled Blue Note albums of all time. This album has been sampled in so many hip-hop albums, it's unreal. I don't even know if there's a running count on how many times this record's been sampled. So if you're not a jazz guy, you can identify with this record anyways, because you've heard a lot of it. You've heard little clips and you've heard little beats and breaks from this record in music from the 70s and 80s, 90s, even, you know, they still sample this record. So this is a great record for that kind of R&B / early hip-hop listener. Again, this is the Music Matters jazz version. There's no real decent sounding pressing of this in print. There's the I think Blue Note did the 75th anniversary. They did a pressing of this. That's $21.99. That's kind of okay. But yeah. This is another album that kind of fits the same exact bill. The drum break on Ode to Billy Joel is Ode to Billy Joe is one of the most iconic drum breaks in all of hip hop. If you listen to more than one hip hop record, you have heard the drum break at the beginning of this record. Every time I put this on, it's kind of funny in the store. People hear that initial drum lick, and then they kind of look up and they're like, well, that's not what I thought it was going to be. But if you're an early hip-hop guy, if you're an early R&B guy, younger guy, this is an absolute fantastic record to get started with. Also, this particular Tone Poet is in print. This is an amazing sounding, all analog, cut by Kevin Gray from the original master tape. In print now, it's $34.99. You can get it on our website at theingroove.com. But this is an absolute fantastic sounding record. And this is an album, you know, if this is going to be your first jazz record, this is a solid choice. This is kind of going to be along the same vein. Herbie Hancock's Imperial Islands. One to consider, you know, one of his top albums. But the main track on this was redid in maybe the 80s, Cantaloupe Island. So you're hearing the original on this. You've heard the remake a gazillion times. Everybody's heard it on the radio. You know, it's kind of a version where they sampled it and they kind of, you know, they kind of hip-hopped over it, scattered. But yeah, you've heard that track on this album. It doesn't matter if you, I mean, unless you're listening to, you know, medieval classical music only, chances are you've actually heard Cantaloupe Island on this record. So this is, again, when you can buy something in a genre of music that you're not familiar with and your brain can kind of gravitate towards that and be like, oh yeah, I'm familiar with this. Yeah, this is great, man. This is better than that original. Wow. I mean, that's my thought on it anyways. But if you're kind of, your brain gets going, and then, you know, the rest of the album starts to make sense to you. So, fantastic Herbie Hancock album. There's a ton of Herbie Hancock albums that are, I mean, absolutely essential. But this is a good one to get you going. Unfortunately, the same thing. I think there's a Blue Note 75th anniversary of this floating around maybe on the website, $21.99. It's okay sounding. We need to get a high-quality repress of this. Unfortunately, we don't have it. This is another Music Matters pressing that goes for, you know, probably $200 now. One of my absolute favorite jazz records. I love jazz guitarists. I know people are about the blowers. They like the, you know, the sax men, but I really dig Kenny Burrell. I dig Grant Green. I really dig the guitar players. Absolute fantastic record. I play the guitar myself, poorly, but I play. So, I mean, I hear this, and his ability to play the guitar. I mean, he's not like Jimi Hendrix to where he's obviously going to town, but I just do not understand how somebody could play the guitar so clean. It's not a distorted sound. It is a, you know, if you're a guitar player, it's very hard to play clean to where, you know, it's just the guitar. There's no distortions. There's no effects on the guitar. To play clean is extremely hard. And what he's able to do on this record, playing it clean, his flow and his rhythm is just absolutely unbelievable. Stevie Ray Vaughan covered Chitlin's Con Carna on this album. I think it's on The Sky is Crying. I'm not a huge Stevie Ray Vaughan fan, but he covered that particular track on here. You've probably, if you're a Stevie Ray Vaughan fan, you've heard that. The original is on this. But this is a very laid back, you know, you feel free, guys. You should check some of these albums out on, you know, if you want to kind of sample some of these albums, kind of, you know, maybe stream them. They don't sound nearly as good. It's only going to give you a vague idea. There's something special about putting the record on and listening to it. It's a whole different conversation. It's a whole different video, but this is a fantastic, laid back, it's a very chill album. You know, if you're a guitar guy, if you're a fan of guitars, this is an absolute essential album. You know, what's his name, copied the cover of this, Elvis Costello. I mean, this iconic, it's an iconic cover as well. It's an iconic Blue Note cover that's been emulated and copied, and there's a reason why. It's an amazing album. This is actually, so if you're like a guy who is into harder stuff, if you're a guy that's into metal and you're a guy who's into punk, chances are you're not going to be asking me about, you know, jazz records. But if you are, Miles Davis's Jack Johnson. It is a record that is essentially 2 tracks. Not essentially, it is 2 tracks. So side 2 is, or excuse, let's start with side 1, Right Off. Doesn't say how long it is, but it's, you know, 18, 20 minutes. Yes or Now, side 2, is another 18, 20 minutes. You get 2 tracks. And it is just one of my absolute top favorite, you know, one of, in my opinion, Miles Davis's best albums. But the guitar work on this is just, this is a cooker, man. Killer guitar work. And, you know, Miles kind of, he laid down his horn parts in a way that are, they flow with the album, they groove with the album. But you almost think of him on this, to me, I almost think of him as an accompanying musician. This is really more along the lines, if you're like a Grateful Dead fan or Jimi Hendrix or that jam era of rock and roll, to where, you know, the hippies would go to a concert and they'd listen to somebody jamming out to a 35-minute solo. I mean, that is what you have here. This is a fantastic 2-song record with just blistering guitars, jamming out. Fantastic Miles Davis record. Yeah, Miles Davis and Jack Johnson. Kenny Burrell, like I just talked about. There's no good sounding pressings of that available. Maybe, I don't even know if they did that. Was there a 75th? Maybe there's a 75th anniversary floating around. $21.99 sounds okay. There's a version of this that's in print. They just reissued it. I have not listened to it. I'm not 100% sure of the sound quality, but it's available on our website at theingroove.com. This is unfortunately the version to get, and it went out of print. It shot up into price quick. I would tell people all the time, man, this is the record. You know, listen to this record. It's fantastic. It sounds great. They bought it for $35. Little do they know how many of those people that bought that record from me, and there was a lot. I mean, I think this is going for like $150 now. So, you know, if those people ever go to sell this record, they're going to go, oh, I'm glad I listened to that guy. Even if I don't like the album, I made some money. Classic. I mean, you know, what do you say about John Coltrane's Blue Train? This is considered one of the top jazz albums of all time. You know, Blue Train, on Blue Note, killer record. This is, you know, from that bop era. This is just, you know, if you're a rock and roll guy, if you're, you know, how do you describe it? It's just, it's fantastic. It's just, you know, the personnel that are on these records, and you try to explain to somebody a jazz album as opposed to a rock and roll album. You know, when you listen to a Beatles album or you listen to a Rolling Stones album, you're essentially listening to, you know, you're listening to the Rolling Stones. But, and I try to tell people, like, well, the equivalent in jazz is, you know, let's take the Rolling Stones and let's take the Beatles and let's take the Doors and let's take Jimi Hendrix. Let's throw these guys into a band and let's have them make an album, because that's the equivalent of what some of these albums are. The personnel that are on these records, Lee Morgan, Paul Chambers, Philly Joe Jones, John Coltrane, Kenny Drew, these are all guys that had amazing landmark albums on their own. These guys were all superstars. But that's the thing that's unique about jazz. You know, jazz in this era was not, you know, big stadium shows and, you know, zillions of dollars and you made millions of dollars and you partied like a rock star. That was not the thing, you know, in this era, really in the United States, of any era of jazz. So it was very common to get the absolute best of the very best to go play on somebody else's record. John Coltrane go play on this record. Miles Davis would go play on this record. You know, that was common in jazz. And this is kind of the culmination of some of the absolute greatest players of all time getting together and jamming out on a record. And, you know, it's, yeah, it is a fantastic record. This is kind of a record that more than likely a lot of people in my store gravitate to, who are just listening to it overhead and they're like, man, this is fantastic. I've never heard anything like this. You know, do you have this? And it's like, well, I've got this Blue Note 75th Anniversary Edition that sounds okay. That's $21.99. Unfortunately, you're listening to a Music Matters or you're listening to original. Don't quite sound this good, but it's musically, this is what you're buying. But yeah, John Coltrane, Blue Train. This is one of my absolute all-time favorite albums. It is a bossa nova album. This is the record that started the bossa nova craze in the 60s. This is kind of like, how you could say maybe Elvis's first album kind of really got rock and roll into the main light. This is the album that got bossa nova into the limelight in the 60s. Gets Galbardo. You've probably heard The Girl from Ipanema would be kind of the pop hit, that probably made a crossover on the pop charts at the time. But a lot of this album, I'm assuming, was, this was a crossover album to where, yeah, it's a jazz album, but, some of these jazz albums of the era, they crossed over into the pop stations, and this is one of those albums. This, as well, you can still buy. This is the absolute best version of this album I have ever heard. This is the Analog Productions 45 RPM version of this. It's available on our website, $54.99. It's 45 RPM, but the sound on this thing is absolutely fantastic. Astrid's vocals on this are, it just oozes sex appeal. It is she has almost an erotic way of singing. It's absolutely fantastic. I love the album. Again, it's easy to recommend an album that kind of started a genre of music. Well, obviously these next two, you can obviously see the other one there, Dave Brubeck's Time Out, and Miles Davis's Kind of Blue. I'm not going to try to sort these. These both are these are the two best selling jazz albums of all time. Starting with Kind of Blue. Kind of Blue is just, it probably would be considered the best-selling jazz album of all time, but you'll listen to different lists. You'll look at different lists, and sometimes I'll see Dave Brubeck's Time Out on there. Sometimes I'll see Miles Davis's Kind of Blue. But this is an absolute unbelievable album. And it's amazing the people that can get into jazz from this particular album. There's something about it. It was groundbreaking because it was an album that kind of redefined jazz at the time. Miles Davis did that all the time, though. Almost every single album of his was redefining jazz and pushing the genre forward. But at the time, this was a smash hit. It was on Columbia Original. It was an absolute smash hit for Miles Davis. It was mainstream. And you could tell it's mainstream. And I'll tell you how you can tell it's mainstream. So I buy record collections all the time. And you can always tell if an album, I'm not old enough to remember what was going on in the 50s. I wasn't alive. But an album is mainstream when you look at the music that was in the collection. So many times I will get a collection of music and it'll be Lawrence Welk, and it'll be Maltavani, and it'll be, you don't find Art Blakey records in those collections. You don't find Horace Silver. These were like records that were for urban markets, and they just didn't exist in the mainstream. These were short-run records. You will many times, and it always blows my mind because how good of an album it is, and it's a valuable album nowadays, the original. But you'll be flipping through Lawrence Welk, and you flip through these chuddy dollar worthless records, and you'll find Miles Davis's Kind of Blue in there. Because this was an album that crossed over into the mainstream. This was an album that came out, and at the time, it might not have been socially acceptable to be buying art, if you were a white farm boy or whatever the case might be. It might not have been okay to buy something like an Art Blakey or Horace Silver or a Sun Ra record. That wasn't something that you did. But Miles Davis kind of broke over. He was the Elvis Presley of jazz. He broke over into a mainstream white audience, and man, it went in a big way with Kind of Blue. It's an amazing album. And again, like I was talking about, the who's who of who's on it. Paul Chambers, Bill Evans on piano, John Coltrane, Wynton Kelly, James Cobb, Cannonball Adderley. Again, it's the absolute best of the best players. It's an amazing jazz album. It's one of the top selling albums I have in this store even today. You know, this album came out in 1959. It's 40, 50, 60 years old almost. You know, it's now 60 years old, right? 40, 50, 61 years old at the timing of making this video. And it's amazing how many of these records sell. You know, I sell a ton of Kinda Blue, Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, Fleetwood Mac, Rumors. I mean, there's just certain albums that just sell, 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 sell. And this is one of them. Miles Davis is Kinda Blue. And it's amazing, too, who can get into this album and say, man, that was really good. I had a guy come in and he asked me recently, you know, let me recommend me a jazz album. And I recommended Kinda Blue. Now, he was trading me in some records, but what was he trading in? He was trading in, you know, heavy-duty metal, you know, Iron Maiden and Sepultura, and, you know, a lot of the heavy stuff from the last 10 years on CD, some vinyl. And, you know, he said, you know, recommend me a jazz album. And I recommended him Kinda Blue. And he came back to the store today and he's like, yeah, I really dug that album. But that's the power of this particular album. It doesn't matter what genre of music you're into. There's just something about it. And when you listen to it that first time, it doesn't quite, you know, you listen to it and it's like, right, but it grows on you. You listen to it and you listen to it and you listen to it. And then, man, it's like, wow, this is fantastic. Let me find more records that are like that. And this is what you want in a jazz record. And I'm not going to say too much more about this record because this is a lot of the same thing. Dave Brubeck's Time Out. This is like maybe the first ever concept album. Came out in 1959 as well. You know, the concept album really didn't start taking place until the 60s and the 70s. Dark Side of the Moon, that kind of, you know, these were concept albums. This is a concept album from 1959. And the concept was time signatures. Every single song on this particular album is in a different time signature. And that is why it's called Time Out. It's a great record because most people have heard Take 5. Take 5 on this was, again, this was a pop crossover hit. We have a grocery store chain in Arizona called AJ's Fine Foods. Time Out is actually used in their commercials. So if you're a Phoenix resident, you have heard that ad nauseum. But, you know, if it's not the best-selling jazz album, it's the second best-selling jazz album of all time. It's an absolute must-have. But it's unique in the fact that it's the same album by the same band, Dave Brubeck, but it's unique that everything is in, and I mean, at the time of making this, they must have really went out of their way on some of this. Some of these time signatures are just absolutely wild on this particular record. But, you know, Dave Brubeck, you know, he toured a lot for the military, a lot of USO shows and whatnot in the 50s. And he was, you know, mainstream, big time mainstream. You know, his band was, to this day, you can find Dave Brubeck albums plentiful. Dave Brubeck sold a lot of albums until the day he died, but this, which was recently. But this album, fantastic, sells a zillion copies. But yeah, that's kind of the two Miles Davis. The Miles Davis and this Dave Brubeck, anybody could, this is like recommendation for everybody. The other albums, I kind of always, like I said, I like to drill down into your personal taste and I ask, what do you listen to? But I can point to these two albums for anybody and say, yeah, pick one of these, you're fine. You know, like if I don't have a lot of time to get into the weeds with somebody, if the store is hopping and popping, recommend me a good jazz album. It's like, okay, here you go. Which one do you want to buy? This is the way to go. Any of these albums, no problem. You know, listen to it. If you like it, maybe you'll want to ask me some more questions in the future. We'll recommend you something else. Maybe it's not for you. But all right, guys, there it is. 10 jazz albums to kind of get you into jazz. I'm Mike. Don't forget to subscribe to my videos. And until next time.